Remember back when DVDs were a thing? You'd have to put a disc in a special player and actually browse through a menu to get to the movie or episode you wanted to watch manually. Wild thing, considering nowadays all we have to do is open an app on our phones and we have multiple DVD libraries available to us at all times. But even a decade ago, streaming was just barely a thing, and if you were one of those people who bought the DVD sets for Hellsing Ultimate Parts 8, 9, and 10, then you were in for the bonus treat of your lifetime. For you see, Hellsing is not the only manga that Kota Hirano has ever written. Heck, it isn't even the only manga in the Hellsing franchise. In 2001, when he was taking one of his infamous hiatuses from the main story, Kota Hirano started a side story which featured perhaps the most interesting character that isn't Alucard in the lead role. Hellsing, The Dawn, ran for 4 issues before Hirano put it on hold like his main series. He revived it a few years later just to release 2 chapters and then drop the whole thing in favor of finally completing Hellsing, which he accomplished a decade after he began the series in 1998. As a result, you might not have heard of Hellsing The Dawn, which resurfaced as a 3-episode miniseries in those DVD sets we mentioned earlier, and it hasn't been spoken of since. Well, until now. This is every volume of the forgotten Hellsing prequel, Hellsing The Dawn. Explore. A Hellsing supplemental starring the Angel of Death, Walter C. Dornez. Hellsing The Dawn miniseries. Hellsing The Dawn started as a fun little side project of Kota Hirano's back in 2001 when he was still not done writing Hellsing itself. He dropped 4 chapters that year and then embarked on one of his infamous hiatuses. When he attended a panel for the announcement of the Hellsing Ultimate OVA series in 2005, fans asked his team whether they would get any more The Dawn episodes, and Hirano's team said that if they wanted more, they would get more. The author infamously exclaimed, "Oh great, more deadlines" at the time, and it looks like Kota-sensei had a serious issue with them because he only dropped 2 more chapters before abandoning the project altogether and focusing on completing Hellsing itself. He then moved on to his next project, Drifters, for which we get a trailer at the end of The Dawn episode 3, and when he was asked about the project in later years, he'd state that this side project was always meant to be a snack for the fans, and though he did plan to write around 86 chapters at one point, he had given up on that in favor of completing his mega hit manga before the OVA got ahead of him like the Studio Gonzo anime did. Because of this 4-year break between the 2 phases of Hellsing The Dawn, only the first 4 chapters of the series got animated for those DVD box sets we were speaking about. But that's fine with us because the leading man of this series isn't our boy Alucard, it's the Angel of Death, Walter C. Dornez. Episode 1 of Hellsing The Dawn opens up in a B-18 bomber jet circling above the general vicinity of Warsaw. The year is 1944, and World War II is reaching its climactic point. Flying in this American death machine are 2 of Britain's finest supernatural soldiers, and a grunt who's been assigned to oversee them. Said grunt was sleeping at the beginning of the episode, but was woken up by a man looking for a smoke. Or should we say boy, because it's 1944, which means Walter C. Dornez, the janitor of Hellsing's trash disposal unit, is just 14 years old. The soldier accompanying Walter says as much and denies him a smoke, but Walter just uses his signature wires to grab his box anyway. He comments on the disgusting flavor of American Spirit cigarettes, his words not ours, and remarks on the general fall from grace of the once great British Empire. They ruled practically the entire world not too long ago. Now they were being forced to rely on the very people who started the domino effect against their supreme power by rebelling in the name of freedom. Walter is clearly a bit of a patriot, but turns out he wasn't talking to his soldier companion about all this. He was addressing Alucard, who we learn is locked away in his coffin awaiting deployment. And the reason why he has been deployed is quite simple yet scary at the same time. If you've seen Hellsing Ultimate, you'll recall that it was mentioned multiple times that Walter and Alucard fought against Millennium during World War II, and that they and the Major know each other. Hellsing The Dawn is the reason why. The scene shifts to Hellsing Manor, where a round-table meeting is taking place. MI6 Intel has just informed the Convention of 12 that the Nazis are close to making a breakthrough with their paranormal research department, and that it would mean an absolute catastrophe for the Allies if that were to occur. Sir Arthur Hellsing, the head of the Hellsing family in the Royal Order of Protestant Knights, breaks it down for his human-fighting compatriots. If the Nazis were to succeed in their research, they would be able to furnish an army that is not only indestructible, but also able to replenish itself and multiply rapidly if allowed to feed. For an analogy, think of the Whites from Game of Thrones, but they're attacking Dunkirk. Christopher Nolan's filmography would either be a movie short or have its first proper horror installment if Millennium's plans were to succeed. The convention obviously freaks out hearing about this because it essentially means their absolute defeat, but Arthur tells them not to worry with a rabid smile stuck on his face. He informs them that he has deployed his best man for the job, and everyone is shocked that he sent a 14-year-old kid into the field because they all know he's talking about Walter. Arthur waves off their concerns by reminding them his codename, the Angel of Death. Walter has been specifically trained to combat supernatural threats. His physical endurance was inhuman, and his skills with the wires was beyond even that. He could easily manipulate them to do whatever he wanted, like grabbing a pack of cigarettes, cutting through a bomber jet's door, landing a coffin, and of course, slicing through his targets. Walter had also been educated in occultism to the extent that he knew how to take care of most supernatural targets, even at his young age. Of course, Arthur doesn't say all this, but the implication hangs thick in the air. The scene then shifts to a research complex in Warsaw, where the Doc is speaking to one of his underlings. Whatever research they've been doing has apparently been going well, because one of their subjects was covered from head to toe with sarcoma, and yet his cells were regenerating faster than they were being destroyed by the cancer. Most of their test subjects had, in fact, managed to survive on a very basic level, despite their transformation into ghouls about 4 hours into the testing. We see one of the subjects lash out and apparently kill another, as all of them start screaming violent words in the manga. We learn that the reason why Millennium had any success in their paranormal research was because they had somehow exhumed the body of Mina Harker, which they'd kept bandaged, bonded, and mutilated just in case she woke up from her eternal slumber. As the Doc was admiring the immortal life force of the vampire, the facility shook from the arrival of Walter's bomber, and he remarked on the annoyance of the Allied resistance. The Doc was confident that soon they would be taken care of as he went out to greet his visitors, but turns out it was the Major who had arrived with the captain to chastise Doc for being late. Hitler had hedged all his bets on the Doc's paranormal research division in order to win the war, and during its course, it had become personally enjoyable for the Major himself. While he appreciated the zeal with which the Doc was carrying out his research, he pointed out that being late on deliveries practically makes all of that useless. The Major beseeches the Doc to tighten the screws on his project and get the gears of the real war rolling as fast as possible, just as Walter begins his downward descent. Before he leaves, the soldier he was traveling with wishes him luck on the mission and admits that he feels ashamed that he, an adult, cannot help out Walter, a child, in these grim circumstances. This is the only time Walter drops his arrogant demeanor and thanks Sarnt for his blessings with a genuine smile on his face. He then hurtles through the night sky as episode 1 comes to an end. Episode 2 opens with Walter crash landing inside the Doc's research facility and interrupting the Major's meal, as well as his secret research project. The Major looks unbothered by Walter's arrival, choosing to comment on the exquisiteness of the dish in front of him, but he does take the time to turn Walter's comments about his weight into a weirdly charismatic villainous trait. Walter tries kicking a knife in his direction to grab his attention, but it is caught and crushed by the captain, with the Major simply choosing to ramble on about Doc's surprising cooking prowess. The Doc, who was freaking out at Walter's appearance, and even before that, turns around with authority once the Major's SS troops show up to protect them from the Angel of Death. He chastises Walter for his actions like the child he is, but is left speechless when Walter manages to effortlessly slice every bullet sent his way into metal bits, and the men who shot them as well. This impresses the Major enough for him to take his eyes off his food and compliment Walter for his skills. He then makes a rather unexpected proposal. He asks Walter to join Millennium. He says that Walter has seen what Millennium can accomplish, and he knows that Hellsing's butler would like to put his skills to better use. He even taunts Walter by saying that joining Millennium is what he wants as well, at which point his eyes flare up momentarily, but then he regains his composure and introduces himself as Hellsing's elite trash disposal unit. And baby, it was time for a clean. Walter sends out his wires in the direction of the Major and the Doc, but they're caught in time by the captain, whose elite werewolf physiology allows him to endure inhuman amounts of pain. The Major is disappointed by Walter's rejection, but he proceeds to clear the area, leaving only the captain behind for this fight against Hellsing. The Doc starts to express concern, but the Major reminds him that Captain doesn't need backup. In fact, having allies around would probably just slow him down. Episode 3 opens up with a conversation between Sir Arthur Hellsing and Sir Hugh Irons, who is called Islands in the dubbed version for some reason. person, and this is a switch around because in the manga, this conversation takes place in Chapter 2, just like the contents of Episode 2. Despite knowing of his skills and reputation, Sir Hugh Irons is worried that Walter might not be able to get the job done because he was just a child after all. Sir Arthur has no such concerns. He's delighted that Walter is finally out of the house and he can eat, drink, and fornicate to his heart's content. He had 2 women lined up already, and the manor was a mess because Walter wasn't around, but Arthur wasn't going to let this chance pass him by. It's a surprising moment of levity for a franchise as dark and gritty as Hellsing, but it is much appreciated. The seriousness of his butler's mission isn't lost on Arthur, however, as he was with Irons because they were currently monitoring Walter's mission remotely. It's a good thing that video telecasting wasn't as easy in the 40s as it is today, because if they'd have live streamed Walter versus the Captain Round 1, Arthur and Irons would have flown out to Warsaw themselves. Walter got absolutely crushed by his inhuman opponent. Though he got the upper hand initially, his arrogance led him astray, and eventually put him in a position where he nearly got choked out by the captain. It was at this moment that the pool of the fallen SS soldiers' blood that had collected around Alucard's coffin rushes inside of it, releasing the no-life king himself, or shall we say herself, because this is canonically the debut of Alucard's girly card form. Walter chastises Alucard for getting on the job late and not taking a form appropriate for the task at hand, but the Nosferatu reminds him that he can take any form he likes, for he is, in truth, formless. Alucard blows off the hand that the captain was using to choke out Walter with a Tommy gun and claims that backup had arrived, and it was time to hunt down some werewolves. After this, the miniseries transitions into a trailer for Hirano's then latest project, Drifters, after which we never see or hear from Hellsing the Dawn ever again, but that's just in the animated format. Recall how we told you that only 4 of the total 6 chapters from this prequel project had actually been adapted? Well, things would have made a lot more sense to Hellsing viewers who accidentally stumbled across this bonus content if they'd animated the last 2 chapters as well, because it just ties into the main story so perfectly. A bridge to the main story very nearly became a gag manga. What happens at the end of Hellsing the Dawn, and how does it set up Hellsing Ultimate? The last 2 chapters of Hellsing the Dawn sees Alucard and Walter square up against the captain. Alucard starts warning Walter not to get too cocky against his opponent because it wasn't a vampire, but it wasn't exactly human either. He claimed that crosses, ceremonial items, holy water, nothing would work against his kind, and that he personally thought that all of them had died. The scene shifts to the Major, walking down a hallway and barking orders as usual. He commands his underlings to pack up everything in the facility and move out as quickly as possible. The Doc expressed confusion at this retreat because he was aware that Hellsing had only sent 2 operatives to Warsaw, but the Major was aware of just how powerful Hellsing truly was. He told the Doc to not underestimate Britain, lest it suck him dry of all his life's blood, and just then, one of his soldiers alerts him to Alucard's presence. The Major is overjoyed at learning that the original Nosferatu himself had arrived to grace them with his presence, and he asks all his men to drop everything and watch this fight play out, because it was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Monster was going to fight monster as the full moon rose up into the night sky and triggered the captain's transformation into a werewolf. Alucard estimated that the captain must have been at least 100 years old, as he and Walter engaged him in combat. Walter went in first, breaking the captain's advance towards Alucard with his wires and trying to string him up with them instead. Alucard tells Walter to mind his head because he was aiming for the captain's, and he lets out a hail of bullets in the werewolf's direction. The captain barely recovers, and Walter is about to call for a joint assault when Alucard becomes a gag character. He decides to ditch the fight because, number 1, a werewolf is not a vampire, and hunting vampires was his specialty, and number 2, there was Walter's English pride to consider. Not to mention that if they didn't track down the ringleader of this year's circus, the world would be in big trouble, so he told Walter to deal with little Woofy while he went and hunted the big bad wolf. The reason we call Alucard a gag manga character here is because of how Hirano draws his face, unbothered, unimpressed, and just generally annoyed. Alucard tries to leave, but the Major blocks his way, so he barks at him because to order a dog around, you need to speak to it in its own language. His words, not ours. The captain is enraged by this comment, and he sends a thrust kick in Alucard's direction, which completely disintegrates his form, but turns out this was intentional. Alucard was just looking for an opportunity opportunity to escape, which the captain had just provided him with. He uses his shape-shifting powers to turn his coffin into a multi-armed chariot and rides it out of the room before Walter even has the time to curse him out. Alucard and the coffin then bolt the door behind themselves, as Alucard whines about the old man sending him to a dying country while puffing on a smoke. Meanwhile, Walter is livid with Alucard, and he even breaks the fourth wall by calling him an a-hole for making such a weird exit. Alucard doesn't care because he's got bigger fish to fry, but just as he turns around to go look for the puppet master of the show, he runs into Rip Van Winkle. Rip looks flustered as she is looking for the enemies that have invaded the research facility in an attempt to stop them, but she clearly doesn't know how they look, because Alucard has to convince her that this little girl she was seeing was in fact her enemy. This starts a semantics infinite loop where Rip Van Winkle makes one-syllable sounds and Alucard denies being any of them before she finally realizes who Alucard is and draws her gun. Just as she does this though, Alucard's coffin chops her in the head and kicks her away, rendering her unconscious. He jokingly comments on the length of Rip Van Winkle's flintlock, and she doesn't even see the irony in his comments because she actually starts correcting him. The final panel of Hellsing the Dawn shows Alucard getting ready to use said flintlock in a confrontation with approaching silhouettes, who no doubt were going to be Millennium soldiers of some kind, but we will sadly never know. This chapter was the last one published for Hellsing the Dawn, and though Hirano did state he wanted there to be 86 chapters for the story at one point, it's clear he's got a bit of a problem finishing things up. Even Drifters, which was promoted through the Dawn supplemental, remains unfinished till this day, so we know he wasn't just kidding when he publicly whined about getting more deadlines in 2005. But he did manage to give the story a conclusion, because despite its highly unorthodox ending, Hellsing the Dawn did end up influencing the story of Hellsing itself. We've already talked about the scenes in which Alucard, Walter, and the Major reminisced about their fight during the good old days, but there are others as well. For instance, Rip Van Winkle instantly freezes up when she realizes that the Hellsing operative deployed to deal with her was none other than Alucard himself, because their previous encounter had haunted her for the past 50 years. Despite rejecting it in The Dawn, Walter does end up turning on Hellsing and joining Millennium in the main story, which is contextualized through the events of The Dawn for us. After Walter and Alucard took down every major Millennium research facility in Warsaw, the Angel of Death apparently decided that Alucard was just what the Major described him as, a monster. So he secretly accepted Millennium's offer and joined them as a double agent, feeding them information whenever he could and generally doing everything in his power to prevent Alucard from waking up again. Apparently, after the Warsaw expedition, Arthur Hellsing locked up Alucard because he was afraid of his immense powers. But we've seen that Arthur is a disorganized party boy in his personal life, and he relies heavily on Walter for helping him carry out his own duties. It's possible that Walter convinced Arthur to let Alucard go into a death sleep instead of keeping him active and in the field where he could kill more people than he could help. When Arthur passed away and his brother tried to usurp the leadership of Hellsing from his daughter Integra, the Convention of 12 had alerted Walter of this, and yet he was not even present at Hellsing Manor when Richard tried to kill his own niece. In the first anime series, the Jackal is a badass weapon upgrade Alucard receives from Walter to increase his own firepower considerably, but in Hellsing Ultimate, the Jackal was a trap. After defecting to Millennium without alerting anyone in Hellsing and keeping it that way for 50 years, once the Battle of London approached, Walter knew he no longer had any need to keep posing. He joined the Major on one of his Zeppelins and underwent a procedure that turned him into a very powerful artificial vampire, but with the drawback of getting de-aged over time before eventually he passed away. Walter starts his final showdown against Alucard at the prime of his body, but it ends as the 14-year-old boy he was when he went to Warsaw with the Count all those years ago. During their fight, the Jackal is revealed to have been rigged by Walter for this very encounter, and though it was a clever idea, it was ultimately fruitless considering Alucard's true immortality. The Captain also makes a comeback in Hellsing Ultimate, but somehow he feels more like a featured player in The Dawn, and he's killed by Ceres Victoria in Ultimate, so there isn't much to talk about there. However, the rest of it does make complete sense in the context of where the story ends up going, at least from a continuity standpoint. Apart from that last chapter, which felt like a total comedy, unlike everything else that preceded it, Hellsing the Dawn is an appropriately badass prequel series for an appropriately badass franchise, and our only regret is we didn't get to troll Alucard throughout either manga, because Walter may be the hero of this story, but Alucard was the vibe. Marvelous verdict. And speaking of vibes, we don't want to kill yours, but sadly that's all we have for you when it comes to the Forgotten Hellsing prequel. After reading the 6 chapters and watching the 3 episodes based on it, we have to agree with Kota Hirano when he called Hellsing the Dawn just a snack. But it is a delicious snack nonetheless, which somehow whets the appetite even more despite being rationed out more than World War II food coupons. Having said that, what we really want to know is what you guys thought about this prequel. Let us know what you thought about it in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one.